This is Let Your Voice Be Heard, right here on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem.
We are back on Let Your Voice Be Heard on 90.3 FM, WHCR, the voice of Harlem. And Selena's mic is fighting back.
It is.
Yeah, that mic fought me last week.
Oh,
And I was
yeah,
all
it did.
like,
Yeah, it's
wrestling with it.
Weren't you talking? It like slapped you in the mouth?
I like put it up and down and side to side. Wow, this sounds
Never
really
let her
dirty
pump-
right
yeah.
now.
That sounds very dirty. That's what she said. So welcome back to Let Your Voice Be Heard right here on WHCR 90.3 FM. As I mentioned before the break, we are starting off this show talking about justice for Muslims. As I mentioned, this movement started off with the hashtag Muslim Lives Matter, which was being tweeted for the last few days. And the reason being, there was a fatal shooting of 3 Muslim American college students near the campus of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill by a white man. And it sparked global outrage as well as the hashtag. Now, the victims, they have been identified as 23-year-old, and jump in if I butcher their names, 23-year-old Diad Shadi Barakat, his wife, who was 21 years old, her name was Yusur Muhammad, and her younger sister, who was 19 years old, her name was Razan Muhammad Abu Shahal. And they were shot. This man, he lived in the apartment complex, and they had a little scuffle over a parking space apparently, and then he knocked on their door. So like the 3 Muslim students were all in their apartment, and then the man came, knocked on their door, and shot them execution style, 1 shot to their head each, and they all died. Now, the man has been identified as Craig Stephen Hicks. He is 46 years old. He is white, and he's a self-described atheist. So as soon as the attack happened, both his wife and his lawyer have came out and saying, you know what? This dispute, this shooting had nothing to do with race or religion. It was about an ongoing dispute that these 2 neighbors have been having when it comes to the parking space. And then his lawyer also said, he alluded that this has to do with mental illness, right? So, I mean, it's just, I know this story really touched me, and I understand the outrage, because it's like every time a black and brown person kills somebody, we blame it on gang violence or we blame it on terrorism. But why is it that when a white person does something, it's mental illness and they're a lone wolf, and it never represents a larger part of society? It shouldn't, but it only happens to black and brown people. And especially Islamophobia, the Islamic community in the age of Islamophobia. After 9/11, I mean, we've seen how many attacks on Muslim Americans simply because of their faith. And, you know, it's fueled by ignorance, and it's also fueled a lot by the media. And we're going to touch upon that. And we're going to go in depth. And we have a very special guest who I would like to introduce to our segment. We have Zead Ramadan, who is a board member of the Council on American Islamic Relations in New York. He has also served for 15 years on Community Board 12 in Manhattan. He is the founding board chair of the Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz Memorial and Educational Center, as well as the Northern Manhattan Arts Alliance. And fun fact, Zead came on our show back in 2013 when he was running for city council right here in Manhattan, and he is back. Welcome back so much, Zead. You talked during the introduction a little bit, but now it's time for you to really formally introduce yourself. If the community in Harlem is not already familiar with you and your work and everything you've been doing to serve this community, then please feel free to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Selena. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys. It's always great to come back because this is one venue where you could really speak openly and frankly and honestly about how you feel, not just as a representative of constituency that you have or anything, but just talk about from your heart, what you actually feel about situations that go on around you. And you don't feel constrained to hold back from your description of the reality that you understand, your perception of the world. So it's always a pleasure to be here.
Definitely. And I understand that you had a special announcement about the Dr. Betty Shabazz Center here in Manhattan. Please go ahead.
More than Malcolm X.
Yes, the Malcolm X Center. Sorry about that.
Well, I'm the chair of the board of the Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz Memorial. And this is Black History Month, and I think it's important that we remember that Malcolm X was assassinated on February 21st, 1965. So this is the 50th memorial commemoration of the martyrdom of Malcolm X. And Malcolm X has become, he's become part of the consciousness of conscientious youth, not only in America but worldwide. And this is the only time, probably in our lifetimes, except for you young folk, that you might see this degree of this important date. It's the 50th commemoration memorial, and you guys might see the 100th, but folks like old folks like me won't probably. But at the end of the day, this is a very important time for people to be conscientious of what Malcolm X talked about, what he preached about. The last segment of his life, really, he became an internationalist and said, you know what, we're all in this together. It's people who are struggling to try to create justice and equality for all, not just equality but equity for all. So it's very, very important that that people get Malcolm on the mind, as I say, during this month and this year.
It's funny you mention that because Malcolm X, believe it or not, despite all the jokes, is one of my heroes. And it was his autobiography, which I read when I was 17 years old, the autobiography of Malcolm X, which I think really influenced the huge shift in my life. And the day he's assassinated and martyred is my birthday, which stinks.
Right. And that's so true. And speaking of Malcolm X and everything that he stood for, justice, and we also know that he was an advocate for the Muslim faith, and he was very proud, and he preached, he definitely advocated for that. And brought that into the spotlight, especially into the mainstream here in America. And that kind of brings us or helps us to segue into the discussion of the topic today, which is justice for Muslim lives. And as I mentioned, this tragedy that definitely, when I first heard the story, I was just so taken back. If you read about the 3 students who died, they were humanists. They went over, 2 of them went over to Turkey and were giving out dental care for free for refugees in Syria. They dedicated their lives to giving back, and they were such huge contributors to our society and to humanity. They were the essence of an American citizen, an upstanding American citizen, and they were shot. And now the big controversy is, should this be treated as a hate crime? Do you think, Zead, we know that you are of Muslim faith. Do you think that their Muslim faith had something to do with this? Do you think that, with everything's going on with Islamophobia, did that come into play?
I was at a vigil yesterday. I was at several vigils this week, and there have been hundreds of them across the country and across the world just in the last couple of days. And our government still hasn't decided how to prosecute this, whether in North Carolina or the federal government, right? And that's the tragedy, because I'm gonna say a couple of things about how it wasn't picked up in the media, et cetera, et cetera. But at the vigil, I walked up to a couple of cops, right? And I said, hey, you guys are licensed to carry firearms. Would you, over any sort of traffic issue, ever walk into a neighbor's house and shoot 3 people in the head? And they were like, now that's crazy. I said, but it's not crazy because the dude gave himself in, told them what he did, so he was not insane. So he conscientiously made a decision. Now, when you look into the story, you find out that Yusur and her sister had told their parents, our neighbor came up to us because he thought we were making too much noise, knocked on our door, and said, you guys got to keep it down. And he pointed at his gun on the side and said, I don't want to have to use this. So he had threatened them before. And this is North Carolina, where you're allowed to carry guns, right? This is a gun-toting society there. So he had threatened their lives conscientiously before. So the person is not insane, and he has a gun, and he chose to kill those people. And the excuse is over some sort of traffic issue. Well, look, the Muslim community has known that thousands of houses of worships, whether it's around the world, in Europe and in America, but I know for a fact, because I've defended a lot of these, houses of worship, whenever you go to them, and the community says, oh, we don't want Muslims to open up a house of worship here. And they go, why? They go, the traffic. They're going to increase more traffic. There's always an excuse about traffic that's being used, right? And that is actually part of sort of a manifest that an Islamophobic group has sent out to communities around the country. If a Muslim group wants to open up a mosque, cite traffic conditions.
Was that just out of curiosity, was that the reason for the debate over the Ground Zero mosque? Mm-hmm. Did they also use the traffic as part of their argument?
That yes, actually they did, but they tried to do a zoning sort of issue, like you can't rezone, but they lost on that in the in the city government. They lost on that issue. But the most important thing is that to say that somebody went and shot 3 people in the head over a traffic issue, it's just not viable. The only reason you do something like that is you have a tremendous amount of hate in you.
Right.
Okay, you have a tremendous amount of hate. And he decided to profess his hate through these people that were obviously Muslims. They were hijabi girls, they're hijabi girls, and all of them had, Muslim names. So
and they were wearing the headscarf. That's what you mean by
the hijab. Is the hijab is
exactly.
the headscarf, right? So they wore that, religiously, meaning that every time they left their home, they had that on.
Right.
So the guy made no bones about knowing that they were Muslim. I mean, there's no bones about that. So when you go and assassinate 3 kids, now you have to understand the lives of these kids, right? First of all, 23-year-old dental student, right? And this kid does humanitarian work.
Across the world.
It seems like it's on his mind 24/7. It's he's unusually humanitarian. I mean when people say, listen, how would you like your kid to be a 23-year-old in dental school, right, studying a PhD? 2, he's going to refugee camps to help orphans and refugees who have absolutely not a shred of light in their life, right? To see peace anytime soon, and he's going to give them dental care. And then, oh, by the way, the girls and him, they would serve the Raleigh and the Durham area homeless folks and senior citizens and give them free dental advice and give them free apparatus. They give away toothbrushes and toothpaste stuff to the homeless people, right? And so when you look at their lives, you go, man, they're exemplary. They're exemplary students. They're exemplary social students, and they're all, believe it or not, right? They wear hijabs, those headscarves, but they're all American.
They were Americans first. They were definitely American first.
Right.
I want to give, if anyone is listening and you want the chance to chime in, the number is 212-650-6903. You can also tweet us at BeHeard_radio.
I just want to point out, and I'm sure you were going to bring it up, but they were following the basic principles of their religion, the religion of Islam. Like, it preaches to do things like this to help the needy and feed the poor and humanitarian work. That's a huge principle of the religion of Islam,
right? And
that's something that people do not talk about. My frustration is, and this is wonderful that they were humanitarians, but so what? Like, it shouldn't matter that they were these good people, even if they weren't going out giving toothbrushes to people and going across the world helping people. They were still people.
I think you see that's the point. You see, when people raise the facts of their accolades, basically how wonderful they were, what we're trying to do is stress the point. So where was the media? Hey, I got a story for you, Mr. Media. CNN, Fox, everybody else. Look. These kids, right, were all American students who were assassinated by a what? By a terrorist. But no one's willing to put that tag on a white dude.
Yep, I haven't heard it.
When that white dude shot the congresswoman in Arizona and those other people, did anybody say he was a terrorist? He was terrorizing people. When you look at the definition of terrorist, you don't see a color of a person. You don't see a religion of a person. You see a description of a situation.
Right. Well, it's the same thing when you look at the Bundy Ranch situation out when they all showed up with, the firearms to protect this guy who had essentially been stealing money and land from the U.S. government that the U.S. government owned and refusing to pay over $1 million in back taxes that he owed on it. And all these people showed up with guns starting to threaten the U.S. government, and they could be described by nothing else but terrorists,
right.
But the media didn't label as terrorists. In fact, I mean, you look at something what they were talking about on Fox, and they were, saluting these guys for standing up to the tyrannical Obama government and stuff like that. So there's all this. I absolutely agree with you. There's 100%. There's a labeling problem, and I personally, think that this is a hate crime. From a legal perspective, it's going to be hard because actually North Carolina does not have felony hate crime law on the books. Now that doesn't mean, they have the death penalty on the books, and there's different factors that can come into play with that, but they actually, unlike New York that has a designated felony hate crime law, they do not. That doesn't mean that there's also couldn't be federal hate crime charges, because the federal government and the FBI, the Department of Justice, could step in and prosecute it as well. But
legally speaking, that's not the issue.
Right.
Look, legally speaking, the dude admitted to shooting 3 people execution style in the head. So it's 25 to life or whatever it is in North Carolina times 3. Okay, so the chances of him getting any day off for the rest of his life from jail or trying to avoid the death sentence is going to be a challenge. I said, that's not the issue. It's the fact that we continuously devalue the lives of colored folks and the lives of Muslims.
Right.
So anybody who's not white, all of a sudden we start to degrade their lives, and we start making excuses for the white person who shoots him. Now, look, we're not against white people, or nobody's against white people. We're just saying, look, we got to call a spade a spade. If you want to call this kind of act a terrorist act, then call it a terrorist act all the time.
Exactly.
If you want to call this act, if you want to say this is insanity, I mean, if you ask me, everybody's insane who shoots a bunch of people, no matter whether religious extremism, political extremism, it's extremism, and it's murderous extremism. So if you're a murderous extremist, then you're terrorizing people and you're a terrorist. But the point is, and this is the whole point that the Muslim community is making. You weren't even willing to pick up the story. It was a local, town story. It didn't hit the airwaves, but this thing would have been, blown up. No pun intended. Blown up all over the news stations if the Muslim had done that.
If it was the other way around.
3 model American students, it would have been bananas all over the airwaves.
Absolutely. I agree. There was actually an article this morning that I was reading about how armed, angry, and white is the typical profile for America's most violent type of extremist. Would you agree with that statement?
Oh, absolutely. Look at the FBI. Look at the FBI website. It'll tell you that 95% of all terrorism in the United States has nothing to do with Muslims. So it's others.
Right.
So others means other people of other faiths. So at the end of the day, we're a tiny part of problems here, but the great vast majority of the problems are done by white people, but they're not saying that. They're not tagging them as that. So they're trying to create a stamp on this thing. Anybody who does something bad is a Muslim. That's unacceptable.
I mean, they do the same thing with the black community, as well. It comes from the media. It's interesting because I got into this argument with somebody one day, and they were saying this absurd and incorrect, inaccurate talking point about how all the terrorist attacks have been done by Muslims, right? And I said, well, what are you defining as a terrorist attack? And they said, what do you mean? I said, well, why don't we include all the mass shootings that we've had here in the United States? And then I said, because those are terrorist attacks, aren't they? The guy, after thinking about what I had to say, actually wrote me an inbox message on Politically Preposterous, and he said, I took down my comments because I realized how absurd they were. You're absolutely right. When you start to look at a terrorist attack as all these mass shootings we have, and who perpetuates these mass shootings, it's not Muslims, it's not black people. It's, generally speaking, young, white males with access to a lot of firearms.
Right, and that's totally accurate. I agree with you, Alyssa, and it's about enlightening people, because sometimes it's ignorance, sometimes it's hatred, sometimes it's racism, but when you really think about it and you see what's going on, I mean, the facts are the facts. And I know we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to continue the conversation about Islamophobia and how the media's coverage of ISIS is also fostering Islamophobia, and then we're going to also talk about Obama's new, I don't want to say quote unquote declaration of war against ISIS. So it all plays into this larger scheme of things, and we're going to address it right here on Let Your Voice Be Heard. And we are back.
Selena is hating on the playlist. For some reason,
really
she does
am.
not like Uncle Luke.
Stanley, I was like, where did this come
You don't
from?
like Uncle
Why? But why? We're back on Let Your Voice Be Heard. We're on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. My name is Selena Hill.
And I'm Alyssa Fuchs.
Why are we? I'm Stanley Fritz.
I would. Do you not know your name, Stanley?
I do, but she just said your name, and she said her name, and Zead Ramadan say with us as well. So I figured I would just say my name.
Right.
I said I'm gonna let them say their names.
Yeah, right. I'm like, yeah, I don't know what's happening.
Right. So okay, you just stick to the PC ones and twos, Stanley, since everyone else knows.
Put it this way: if Selena says her name, then reintroduce yourself.
Yeah.
I did.
Okay, we're back on the show, and besides Uncle Luke, we're talking about Islamophobia, ISIS, and also the tragedy that happened at Chapel Hill. We talked about the different ways that Islamophobia is being fostered, whether it's through media, through ignorance, through racism and hatred. And we've also addressed the tragedy again that happened at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and the fact that these 3 upstanding Muslim American students, very young, were just shot execution style by this white man who is white, claims to be an atheist, and also may, according to his lawyers, be mentally ill, but we'll have to see about that. And I wanted to progress the conversation to talk more about ISIS and more about the U.S. strategy in defeating ISIS and how this is being played out in media and how it may or may not be contributing to Islamophobia as well. So I wanted to start that off by asking Zead, our guest right now, how do you think that media, especially like Fox News and the conservative stations, how do you think that they are covering ISIS? Do you think that it's helpful? Do you think that it's harmful? I mean, as a Muslim American yourself, how do you feel about that?
Well, personally, and almost every single person that I've ever met who's a Muslim feels that, ISIS is an extremist organization that does not, and they're a violent extremist organization that does not represent what we believe Islam is. So if people try to project that ISIS represents Islam, then they're lying, okay? Because 99.9% of Muslims around the world are looking at these dudes like they're a bunch of Looney Tunes, crazies. And, decapitations and burning pilots in cages, those are not Islamic ways. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he made absolutely clear that you do not defile humanity in that way. Ever. There's no excuse whatsoever. He's your enemy. Prophet Muhammad, took captive the people who killed his family members, and he allowed them to be free, okay, and said there's going to be no retaliation upon you, as long as we could live together in peace, because there was a situation where we were at war, and even though anyway, the bottom line is this. What they're doing is very un-Islamic. It does not represent Islam. It does not represent Muslims around the world. Shiites are appalled by it. Sunnis are appalled by it. Sufis are appalled by it. Everybody's appalled by it. So when the media tries to make look at Islam right here through the scope of ISIS, they're lying to you. They're basically saying, 0.00, like Timothy McVeigh represents Christians in America, the guy who blew up the Oklahoma State building. No, he doesn't. He represents his own insanity. He represents his own violent rhetoric. He does not represent Christianity. Or the same thing if the Jewish guy who shot, I forgot his name, he shot 29 Muslims praying in Hebron in a mosque in the back while they were praying, prostrating to their Lord. Does he represent Judaism? No. Judaism does not say shoot people while they're praying to God in the back, and you're okay. Okay, that's extremists, and those are zealots, and they're violent. Right. So when you have a violent, zealous extremists, but the media loves to take those crazy stories that are on the fringe of society that represent 0.00001 of reality, of everybody else's reality, and say, this is what those people are like.
Right. So why is the media covering it, especially like Fox News and the conservative media? And tell me if you think liberal media is doing the same thing. But why do you think this is happening? Is it a fear of other? Is that what's going on here in America?
Well, America, we have short memories here in America. I'll be honest with you, we have short memories. So first of all, we forget that we helped create ISIS. Right. What does that mean? You mean we actually put those people together? No, what happens is this. We had an issue with Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and we had an issue with the Iraqi government, so we go in there, and we help dismantle those governments, right? And then we start creating a coalition of groups that are inside the countries, and we say, who hates Saddam Hussein? And they raise their hand, and he says, okay, we're going to give you weapons, but it's like, yeah, but 2 out of those 10 people, 2 out of those 10 groups online are pretty fanatical. They're fanatics, they're extremists, and they're gonna turn on you, man. And they're like, we don't care. We're just trying to take this dude down. It was the same thing that we did in Afghanistan. We wanted to take out the Russians, and the Russians invaded from 80 to 88. We said, how are we going to defeat the Russians, right? And then some people who said, I'm willing to die for Afghanistan. And these people came from all over the world, right? They called them Mujahideen. And they were, and they all went there. And so what we did is we sent our military there to train them and to arm them. They eventually pushed out the Russians, right? We didn't have troops on the ground. So what you had was these people who were willing to die, who were well-trained, and who had our United States, arms, and they're standing there in the middle of Afghanistan. Guess what they did? They ran over the whole country. They said, man, we don't have to stop with Russia. No, we can take out our own government who's a puppet of the United States. And then the Taliban eventually took over, and so you have violent extremism who's well-armed and well-trained now in control of that country. So what we do is we create Frankensteins, and we walk away. And the Frankensteins start wreaking havoc on their area. And it's the same mistake that we keep making over and over and over again.
Right. And the thing is with Barack Obama, when he was campaigning, he was definitely against this stance of going to war. And we see that he does preference to use diplomatic measures when it comes to defeating al-Qaeda and the Taliban and now ISIS. But he recently, just this past week, has said he has put out a proposal to Congress asking to authorize the use of military force in the war against ISIS. I mean, the wording sounds very tricky. It's like it's not a war, but we're going to put troops on the ground, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, so what do you make of this?
That's
and
very
will
troubling.
this and will this lead to more of the same thing, history repeating itself, us going into this country, putting troops on the ground and keeping our troops there for another, 10 years? Like, what do you think is going to come of this?
I think that, it's very troubling because it's open-ended. It's an open-ended request to Congress for the use of military force against the terrorist group ISIS. It fails to set any reasonable objectives. The scope of the mission isn't absolutely clear. The geographic boundaries are not clear. And it doesn't include any exit strategy. So his request for, authorizing use of military force to be adopted by Congress should be more narrowly focused to target the terrorist group. It should be a clear mission with objectives and a sunset date. Right now, it just seems like, and we don't want to be the arm to help Assad. I mean, we said, listen, man, this guy's got to go. So now we're arming people, right, against him, creating these Frankensteins. And now we're going back and we want to take out these Frankensteins. So now we're helping Assad again. So the guy who's killed tens of thousands of his own people, bombed his largest cities to smithereens, created refugee camps, refugees, the likes that we haven't seen since World War II. And now we're going back to help him. We're a mess. Our foreign policy in the Middle East is an absolute disaster. There's only one success if they wanted it. There's only one level of success, and that is if they are trying to achieve chaos in the Middle East, then our American policy is actually succeeding.
No, I totally agree with that. And, I just wanted to add to an earlier point that you made that the majority of people that have been killed by ISIS or ISIL or whatever we're calling them these days, I heard there's a new term that starts with a D. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. That's supposed to delegitimize them as sort of being a sovereign group, which I like the idea of that. But most of their victims have also been Muslims. So to say that they represent Muslims when the majority of people that they're killing are Muslims is entirely inaccurate. But going off the point you just said, I totally agree with that. I think every time the U.S. gets involved in something in the Middle East, and we end up making matters worse. Not only do we end up making matters worse, we breed more hatred towards the West because of the fact that we're constantly putting our nose in places where it doesn't belong. And I think that breeds kind of anti-American sentiment over there and drives groups and terrorists like ISIS and ISIL. That, in turn, then drives Islamophobia here in America. And so it becomes this vicious cycle where us interjecting drives their terrorist activity, and then terrorist activity there drives Islamophobia at home, and we keep going around and around and around. And with that being said, Rand Paul actually had been interviewed back in September by Sean Hannity on Fox, and he said that America should stay out of it and that ultimately civilized Islam will have to step up and combat ISIS. So and then he went on to say, I think it's not only important that the American public, but for the world, that the Islamic world, to point out that this is not a true form of Islam. This is an abhorrent form that should not be represented by most civilized Islamic world. So I guess the question for you, Zead, is do you think ultimately civilized Islam should have to step up or will have to step up, and that it's not really America's place to get involved any further? I mean, how does that interplay work together?
Here's the caveat. Okay, here's the interesting caveat that nobody puts into perspective, especially for, Americans. We just see it as us against them, against those crazy Muslims over there, and we're the rational, nice people here. I was listening to a conversation by financial experts on NPR, and the guy said, I spoke to some other international financial policy experts, and I said to them, what is the biggest problem facing our international economy, something that could really, really hurt the economy going forward? And he said, I thought they were going to say something like, the diminishing value of the euro. The euro is getting a beating because of, Greece and Portugal and Cyprus. He says, I asked several people and they all said the same thing. ISIS, ISIS, ISIS. And he said, I was blown away. I said, why ISIS? He said, because they're actually fighting to control the second largest reserves in petroleum in the world. Now, just to put this in a one-sentence perspective, if they mess with petroleum supply around the world, that affects pricing. Now you got to start moving away from SUVs, so it starts affecting the car industry. So it starts affecting the pockets of average people around the world significantly, and starts damaging the financial thing. So at the end of the day, it's not a simple thing where America can stay out of it. America thinks like to control the world economy, we've got to control the resources that move the world. And since we're controlling the world economy, we got to take them out for the dollar sign. If it was up to Barack Obama, he would say, I think, right, he would probably say something like, man, let them be. But if oil is at stake, then he has to play a game. He has to be part of the game, right? So would the Muslims, would the average, Muslims want ISIS out? Of course. The proof of that? Muslims never gave them weapons before. Never gave them. Those fanatics have lived there forever. The zealots are always amongst us. But you don't train them and you don't equip them with violent weapons. Yep. In Afghanistan, they were there. They were there. People, they're the zealots who were going, death equals heaven. Well, look, you don't give those people weapons, because the faster they die, the faster they think they get to heaven. So the philosophy of the Muslims in that region was like, okay, you have the right to your religious expression, no matter how zany it could be, but we're definitely not giving those guys weapons, right? So who's giving them weapons? The United States, to fulfill their foreign policy objectives. And when they do that, these people grow, and they controlled some oil fields, sold oil, and made billions of dollars. So they're getting rich, and they're getting more powerful, and they're buying more weaponry. So it's becoming sort of a vicious cycle of stupidity, stupid policy.
Yeah, no, you had it right the first time. Stupidity, period. Yeah. It's funny because when the war in Iraq was launched, a lot of people were saying that it was about oil, and people wanted to shy away from that. And I was one of the few that agreed. So my question is, if we can agree that it really is petroleum and oil that is driving this, then do you think that's also the reason why President Obama has been exceptionally aggressive in trying to pass executive actions to push for more stricter climate policies and finding new ways to fund green energy?
Look, we all know, and you guys grew up with this. You grew up with this, and the bottom line is the United States has to, stop its dependency on other countries' fuel sources. We have to try to create our own fuel sources, and he realizes that, and he knows that we're going to be in a vicious cycle of stupid policy in the Middle East that we could never ever escape, because we could never ever really control it, right? And since we can't ever control it, we got to figure out something we could control, and that's creating our own resources. And once you do that, then you can just kind of cut Middle East policy becomes sort of a diminished thing on the foreign policy chart, as opposed to being top of the list.
Makes sense.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. Unfortunately, we do have to bring this conversation to a close. But before we do, I want to give Zead Ramadan, again, our special guest of the hour, a chance to sort of bring everything to full perspective, to a full close. You talked about some of the solutions here where it's less dependency on foreign oil, definitely not repeating the same mistakes that we have in the past and learning from that. We don't want to foster and continue to give people who are radicals weapons in order to just pursue our own foreign policy agenda as the U.S. can you just leave us with final words of the U.S. strategy, both abroad and domestically, what needs to be done so that we can not only stop of course, ISIS, which is like the new war on terror and the new thing right now, but also stop Islamophobia and that cycle, which is also being fostered within it.
Yeah, I think that if you look at the Middle East, and you know it's relatively a small area in the scope of the world, but they have more kings and monarchs and autocrats than any other land area around the world, compared to any other land area around the world. So we have been perpetuating things that the American Revolution fought against and the Enlightenment period fought against. We fought for democracy. We fought for a voice for the people. Instead, what we're doing here is we've been fighting on the side of dictators and kings and making sure they stay in place. You know, the Arabic Spring we thought was going to be the beginning of a new democratic era and usher a new democratic era in a place that has historically been dominated by colonists and oppressionists and kings and autocrats. And so if we can go back to really strategizing to saying, look, if we can, those people are good people. Okay, those people over there are good people. We have to acknowledge that those people are good people. And if they're good people and we help them create a democracy, then things will alleviate, because you won't have one psychopath making decisions on behalf of a country. You'll have a parliament. You'll have a Congress. You'll have someone, so I think it's very, very important to, first of all, create a policy towards the Middle East that supports their democratization, in the way that they see it fit. And then two, and real quickly, I think that the media here in the United States has to, start becoming a little bit more objective. But you got the Foxes of the world who are just going to make all black people, evil and bad. They're going to make all Muslims terrorists. They're going to call everybody an other and an outsider. And unless our government or somehow we figure out a way to have the media call a spade and just say, look, we're going to call everything equally, right? Then we're going to continue to paint and propagandize the minds of Americans here, and they're going to continuously have hate in their heart towards people who don't look exactly like them.
Right. I mean, thank you so much for that, Zeed. That was a great way to sort of end this discussion and just to bring it to full circle here. I mean, just to add on really quickly, these are the type of stories that definitely are very disheartening and definitely very discerning. I think that if the media coverage that you tend to watch, and if it's not spotlighting things of this nature, the Chapel Hill shooting, that's what I'm talking about right now, I think that you should definitely switch gears. I think that if this story didn't touch you in a great way, something is wrong in your life, because these are American citizens. These were American students that happen to be Muslim. And it's just, I mean, I think that in order to stop it, we have to educate ourselves, we have to enlighten ourselves, and we have to realize that we have more similarities than we have differences. And there's a lot going on behind the scenes when it comes to foreign policy in our government and our Congress. We'll continue to cover this here on Let Your Voice Be Heard, but it also starts with us and what's in our hearts and how we look at others. And on that note, we are going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're coming back to the news roundup right here on Let Your Voice Be Heard.
Make you feel good like Tony. Pick up in your middle like Moni. Yeah. She don't know me, but she's setting up the. Yeah. Try to style slide off with a homie. Yeah.